We find ourselves in this place where we went from in-person teaching to pandemic teaching virtually overnight. Now, it's important to refer to it as pandemic teaching because it's not virtual learning and virtual teaching, because virtual learning and virtual teaching is when teachers and school leaders and parents and students have had the opportunity to prepare. They've been able to reflect on what works and what doesn't. And we know in a virtual learning experience, students have access to tools. In a pandemic teaching experience, it's been very different. In fact, inequities have really been highlighted during this situation. And we know that we've got teachers that have their own kids at home at the same time they're trying to teach their students. They might be teaching from their kitchen table or even in some cases their bedrooms. And we know that students are at home with their families and there might be multiple kids, even multiple families in one apartment or one household. So is it really possible to practice instructional leadership during this time? And my answer, of course, would be yes. I wrote a book that I published in February called Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice Out of Theory. Now, it was based on my own research that I've done through running workshops around North America, Europe, the UK, and Australia. But it's also based on the deep research that's been around on instructional leadership, one of the most researched forms of school leadership over the past 50 years. And it's based on these 6 principles that I think are even more important now than ever. Because in order to make sure that we're spending our time providing kids with activities that will lead to more than just engagement, but actually to deeper learning, it's really important because also what we're looking at is that at some point we have to go away from pandemic learning and teaching and move into a virtual learning space as schools prepare to maybe be virtual learning places in the first month or even 2 months of school. So the 6 principles are fairly easy to look at. Number 1 is implementation, and I use a program logic model. It's 5 easy steps, and it's based on your needs. So what are your needs in a virtual learning space? And for me, it was about looking at pandemic teaching and bringing it over to virtual learning. So it's based on needs, your resources that you're going to look at, the activities that you're going to do, the outputs, which will be actionable steps to actually carry out those activities, and an impact. What kind of impact do we want to have on student learning during this whole pandemic and virtual learning experience? Number 2, knowledge dimensions. There are 4 knowledge dimensions that I've always looked at within the work, but now we can look at them through a pandemic teaching and virtual teaching experience. Those knowledge dimensions are when we look at factual knowledge, procedural knowledge, conceptual knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. What we know is that a lot of activities that are being sent home through maybe Google Classroom are typically around the factual knowledge place. In fact, over the past few weeks, I've surveyed several hundred students from 4 different countries, and they tell me that most of the work that's coming home is either review work or it's factual knowledge work. Now, review work isn't so bad, just as long as it's not the same review work that we were doing 2 months ago. Review work can be much better for us and provide a deep learning experience if we can create a way where students can do it from surface deep to transfer level learning. The third one of the components of instructional leadership is when we look at student engagement. Now, the student engagement research that I picked up from 1972 from Odetella shows that our students are alienated for one of 2 reasons, or maybe both. They didn't feel personal connection to their school community or their teacher, or number 2, they don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. Both of those are huge issues during a pandemic teaching experience because I also surveyed well over 500 teachers from 9 different countries over the past few weeks. And what they're telling me is that a vast majority of their students are not necessarily showing up to virtual learning spaces every day. In fact, I ended up writing for my Finding Common Ground blog for Education Week, a blog called 6 Reasons Why Your Students Aren't Showing Up to Online Learning, which kicked off all the following research from surveying teachers and surveying students. That blog itself is going to be close to 1 million views very soon. Now, besides looking at student engagement and how we can create this space where students want to be engaged as opposed to the old accountability ways, which is they're looking for a grade or some sort of incentive, which are not existent right now, Student engagement's really about how are we taking into account things like student voice and doing student surveys. The next one on that list would be instructional strategies. And there are specific instructional strategies that you can do through a virtual learning space. One that students really love to talk about is being able to do Zoom meetings or Google Meets. The reason why? They get to see the face of their teacher, and they also get to see the faces of their peers. And it gives them an opportunity to create dialogue. I created a virtual university course that's 16 weeks long, and I'll be teaching in the fall. One of the things that I've utilized is not only Zoom meetings, but also Flipgrid in order to get people to start talking to each other. Those are instructional strategies that we can use to take us from pandemic teaching to virtual teaching. Efficacy, always a huge issue. And in fact, one of the questions that I asked in teacher surveys was how is this building confidence going through this pandemic situation? Because we all understand it's very difficult. We all also understand that it's not as good as being in person with our students. But the reality is, this is our reality. So one of the things that we have to be able to look at is that level of confidence. And that's self-efficacy. Now, from a teaching standpoint, we know that this is a place where we can start to build confidence from teaching virtually because it's not very easy. But the better we get at it, the easier it comes, and the more we can go from surface to deep to transfer level learning. But on the other hand, efficacy is really important for leaders. Because when leaders are looking to be instructional leaders, what are some things they can do to build their own confidence in this virtual learning space as well? And that means being a part of things like Google Meets or virtual classrooms. And then, of course, we can talk about building collective efficacy. It's really important during our virtual PLCs or our virtual faculty meetings. How are we focusing on learning during those meetings? And yes, that's both social emotional learning, but also academic learning. And the last one on the list is impact. What is the evidence of impact? Because right now during this time, it's really easy, especially when schools are going through the rest of the year and they're saying, I just have 4 weeks left and I just want it to end. I'm sorry, but we can't do that because this time is so vitally important because we can take what we're learning during this experience and we can improve upon it and reflect on it over the summer for when we go and we try to go into a virtual learning experience in the fall. We'll be able to have all these lessons that we learned of what worked and what didn't work, what had an impact and what didn't, and be able to use that in our teaching and learning and leading in the fall. So instructional leadership is equally as important now as it has been ever. And one of the things that I learned is through the toughest times of accountability and the toughest times of leading through a pandemic, that's where we can find our best leadership skills.